I will turn off Brian Eno. He's lulling us into a false sense of security at the minute. Hello, welcome. But Brian Eno's dulcet tones are playing in the background. I was going to give a very brief introduction to Dave and a welcome on behalf of St. John's Church. And I'll just give a little potted history about, many years ago, about 35 years ago. Would that be right, Rachel, thinking about this? We were in a church. It was a very passionate church. It was a very excited church. It was a church that we felt passionate in. But we also recognised that the life that we were living outside of the church didn't seem to correspond to what was going on inside of the church. I'm not taking your talk away, am I?
No, you're fine. You just carry on.
We're into music and theatre and philosophy and ideas and going to art galleries and watching films, and church seemed to be just very like, this is the thing, and very narrow and very rigid. And we kind of met loads of people around on the scene who had similar experiences. And then, interestingly, 31 years ago, someone wrote a book called The Post-Evangelical, and this was Dave Tomlinson. And for many people, that was a real eye-opener. It was a window opener. It was like, yes, you didn't even need to read the book, although it's a good book to read. But you didn't need to read the book because loads of people, it seemed, that had been brought up and raised in a church, hi, welcome, had been raised in churches, had felt that it was too constricting and too dogmatic and too caught up in particular ways of understanding. And simply to put out the title post-evangelical, for many people, was a rousing wake-up call. It was a, yes, this is me, this is me, this is my experience. And I got in touch with Dave and said, this is great. And we'd sort of heard of each other through arts and faith kind of things that we'd done together in Greenbelt Festival. And from there started a really good friendship, and it's been really good to occasionally meet and talk about some of these ideas. And it's a real privilege to be able to welcome Dave Tomlinson into this space to talk about that experience and kind of moving on, how to be a bad Christian and a better human being. So, better human being. Yes, I got the title right.
You did.
So the way we'll do this, I think you'll talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes maybe, and then we'll have a short break, time to refresh, and then we'll come back and there can be some questions and answers, some interaction, some discussion, and see where your thoughts take you. We'll be done in about an hour and a half in total, unless we're determined to stay on further. But can I ask you to join with me as we give Dave Tomlinson a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary. What a lovely introduction. And it's true, I think when I wrote How to Be the Post-Evangelical, 31 years ago it came out, yes. It's still alive, actually. It's now in the classics range. And I wrote it thinking I was writing for, some fringe people that I hung out with on the edges of the Greenbelt Festival and different places. And what completely took me by surprise was that within a few weeks of that book's publication, I was deluged with letters. I mean, it was before we had emails, which is amazing, isn't it? Letters from around the country and from different parts of the world. And essentially, the response was just what Gary was saying. It's not, I think, that I said things which were completely new to people. It was that I actually voiced them. And so for an awful lot of people, the response I knew very quickly in these letters was going to be pretty much the same, which was, at last, someone said this. And I think that, as such, it was a kind of what they call in the trade an event book. It was about something that was happening, and which is very difficult to reproduce when you come to doing the second book, I've found. But it was exciting to feel that something was already going on in the hearts and minds of people all over the place. Much later on, this book, How to Be a Bad Christian and a Better Human Being, came out in 2012. There were a few in between, but this book came out in 2012, and this came really out of my life and work as a parish priest in North London. engaging with people. It's one of the wonderful things about the Church of England. There's an awful lot that you can say that's not wonderful, frankly, but one of the wonderful things you can say is that it is still to this day kind of the default church for a lot of people who don't identify as churchgoers. You know, if somebody wants a funeral, a religious type of funeral for one of their loved ones, or they want to get married in a church, they don't tend to go, you know, for whatever reason, they don't go to Baptist churches or Methodists or Pentecostals, they come to the Church of England, which is an amazing honor for those of us who serve in the Church of England, because suddenly you have this inroad to so many people's lives, you know. And again, I would find people would say to me when I was talking with them about a funeral or a wedding or whatever, I'd find people saying, apologetically, I'm afraid I don't come to church very often, which basically meant never, you know, or maybe at Christmas. And I would say, do you know what? I don't think God cares whether you come to church or not. I do. I'm a vicar. I'd love you to come. But if I thought that God was someone who looked at people in that way, who categorized people as churchgoers and non-churchgoers, Christians and non-Christians, or whatever, I would be an atheist overnight, because I think that would be a God who was less intelligent than me, and that's saying something, because even I can see there's a lot more to it than whether people belong to a particular club or whether they tick certain boxes. I think it has a lot to do with who we are as people. That's what matters. And what I found was that many of the people who lived in my parish, or people I met through that sort of work, who never came to church, were probably better followers of Jesus than a lot of us who were in church every week. And it was that inspired me to write this book. So it's not how to be a lousy Christian. I mean, I could have written that book, but it's saying bad Christian in a particular way. And a better human being. So I've written it up here a bit unlike it would be on the cover of the book, in that I've put the better human being in block capitals underneath to say, I think that's what sometimes people miss. They see how to be a bad Christian, but they don't see that other bit, and a better human being, because I've met so many better human beings than me, and lots of other Christians I know, outside of the church, outside of the realm of religion. And that's something that really challenged me, out of which, as I say, this book came. So I think really what I've been on about for a long, long time now, certainly since before I wrote that first book, is looking for a faith that was credible in the world that we live in today. Because I felt that the Christianity I grew up with lost credibility in my own eyes. I felt it didn't have credibility in the world in which we lived. So that's what I'm about all the time. I'm looking for a faith which is credible in the 21st century, which is something that brings goodness into the world, which is increasingly a frightening and unsafe, a tribalistic place. I was looking for a faith which would reverse the processes of what I'm seeing in the world, something that's closing down and becoming tribalistic and growing in on itself. And so that's what it's all about. You know, in 2012, when this book was published, I released it at the Greenbelt Festival. I don't know if you all know what that is, but it's a Christian arts festival held on bank holiday every year. And part of the institution of Greenbelt now is a beer tent called the Jesus Arms. And so there was like a back room to the Jesus Arms in those days, and that's where I published this book. And my publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, very kindly offered to give, well, in fact, they did a deal with the people who were supplying the beer that week to rebrand one of their beers to call it Bad Christian. And
it's a great beer.
It is a great beer, actually. People keep asking me, where can I get Bad Christian? It's not actually called that now, but you know, Greenbelt carried on using that brand for quite some time. And the first 100 people got a beer mat, which was a free pint of beer, to come in to hear me launch the book. So it was a great crowd. And I did my talk and everything else. It was very, very muddy that year. It was like deep. It was classic festival mud. You know what I mean? You had to take your shoes off and just walk through it, really. And at the end of the evening, somebody said to me, "Wow, you were really on fire tonight, Dave." And somebody else said, "Yeah, you were like a liberal evangelist." And I thought, that's an interesting phrase, you know. And it sounded like an oxymoron to me. But I lay in bed that night thinking about it. And as the night went on, I found I could own this, because I think that what our world needs, perhaps today as never before really, is a humanizing, generous-spirited, progressively minded faith that's proclaimed with all the zeal and passion of an evangelist. I think that we need that tub-thumping evangelistic zeal about a message which is not narrow, which is not sort of absolutist and tribalistic, but which is opening up into something that is progressive and liberating in the world in which we live. I think we need the Lord's Prayer today, not as a mindless kind of liturgical anesthetic, which it often is, but as a manifesto for change, because I think that's what it is. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The reign of God's loving kindness, an end to slavery and debt and hunger, for a place of safety and security for all people, but especially those who are vulnerable. So one of the things that I did recently, in fact, the most recent book I did is kind of on the back of this. I wrote a book called OMG, A Bad Christian's Book of Prayers. It's on sale at the end afterwards. And I'd like to sort of set off really with a prayer from that, which is, it's got a picture of me here. Well, what I aspired to be in my youth growing up in Liverpool. You may say I'm a dreamer. If woke means imagining a better world, then surely woke has to be a great idea, right, God? Some dismiss Lennon's dream as sappy, sentimental tosh. All you need is love, etc. Yet most people I know wish to live in that world. I know I'm not the only one who believes that goodness will outlive spitefulness, that kindness will beat the heck out of hatred, or that light will vanquish darkness, because finally, love will endure. But I long for a world where freedom to be outstrips the right to tell others how they should be, where social fears and phobias, xeno, homo, trans and the like, are a thing of the past, along with racism, misogyny and other senseless attitudes. Surely this can't be too much to ask. I believe the golden rule of love and mutual respect trumps, excuse the word, trumps every other rule and far outstrips our fears and doctrinaire proclivities. Am I woke, dear God? I do hope so. Especially if woke means living with compassion, striving toward a world that welcomes strangers, whatever their story, that makes poverty history, that defends the rights of all people and relishes this incredible planet. I don't think woke is something new or faddish for bleeding liberal hearts like mine. It is the wisdom of old, emblazoned in every tradition. Treat others how you wish to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. Just imagine that, I say. It's easy if you try. So, you know, there was a time, wasn't there, when religion and spirituality were kind of the same thing, you know? If you were religious, then you'd be counted as being spiritual. If you were spiritual, you would be religious. And that was the status quo for centuries, probably. But somehow something has happened over recent decades. A gulf has come between religion and spirituality in such a way that there are lots of people who now identify in some shape or form as being spiritual, and there are lots of definitions of that, who are not religious. And sad to say, I think there's an awful lot of religion that doesn't have much spirituality in it, which is just same old, going through the motions. And so this is what's happened. For me, spirituality, I would define as something like this: the universal human yearning to be connected with something beyond the ego self. So that could be defined in lots of ways, but that to me is fundamental. Also, I think spirituality involves a search for values and goals that can reflect that yearning in daily life. And to be honest, I find a lot of that happening in people who never come near buildings like this. And I sometimes wonder why there isn't more of it in these buildings. There was a woman, when I was writing this book, emailed me from New Zealand. I was right in the middle of writing it, and I got this email from this woman. She said, I don't come from a religious background, she said. I joined the church because I thought I was going to be joining a university of spirit. Wow, that's a great phrase, isn't it? Somewhere where I would learn and evolve in the realm of spirit. She said, sadly, I found that it was more of a kindergarten of conformity. And if I didn't sign up, if I didn't go through the motions that everyone else was, then I was going to be rejected. And so she didn't remain there. And I think that links into another part of what I think spirituality involves. I think spirituality can be defined as a form of intelligence, SQ. You know, for a long, long time, we just understood intelligence as being rational, cognitive intelligence that was expressed through a table of IQ. And then in the 1980s, through a number of publications, the whole thing was exploded, and there's a book published which is called Multiple Intelligences that identified the fact that that old definition of intelligence was actually oppressive, that there were people who couldn't necessarily match up very high on a scale of IQ, but had massive intelligence in other parts of their lives. And, you know, physical intelligence, emotional intelligence is the one that became very sort of famous through the 1990s. But toward the end of the 1990s, there was something called spiritual intelligence identified by neuroscientists. And spiritual intelligence isn't to do with religion. You could find atheists who have huge spiritual intelligence, and people who are religious who don't have very much. Because it's not to do with religion, it's to do with that out of which religion originally came. It's to do with searching for meaning to things in the world, in life. It's about the whys rather than the whats, you know? And this kind of intelligence, I think, can be expressed in lots of different ways. I've just put up a few here as examples. Faith, certainly, but I think through the world of nature, you know, intelligence, spiritual intelligence can be evolved and developed. Relationships, justice, goodness, art and creativity, all of these things are different realms in which spiritual intelligence is expressed, which doesn't necessarily have an awful lot to do with the church and religion. And I've always liked this quote by Lenny Bruce, the stand-up comedian, who long ago said, every day people are straying away from the church and going back to God. And I think there's, you know, an enormous amount to be said for that point of view, that lots of people, some of whom have grown up with and been a part of church-going religion, come to a point of feeling that it just doesn't really do it. It doesn't match up. It doesn't take them anywhere. And their longings, their spiritual longings and aspirations are being sort of stunted by dogma, by, you know, the imposition of creeds and all that kind of stuff. And so people start to look out in some of those other areas that I've just mentioned there. And probably an important factor in all this is God. Who is God? How do we picture God? And there's a guy long ago called J.B. Phillips. I don't know if any of you remember J.B. Phillips. He wrote his own kind of paraphrases of books in the Bible. But he also wrote a book called Your God is Too Small, which I've always loved that title and wished I could write a book with that title. And Because sometimes, and I'm someone who spent my whole life in church. I'm an ordained priest in the Church of England. You know, my life has been committed to the church and still is. And yet there are times when I want to sort of open the door at the back and shout in, your God is too small. And I guess for an awful lot of people, one way or another, their God is kind of in this sort of model, okay? I'm a very keen amateur photographer, which is where I got this photograph from. But this sort of image of God as being a super being out there, up there, somewhere out there, is, I think, a huge problem. And I think it is what has turned an awful lot of people away from the realm of religion and faith, because they just can't identify with this idea of this super being who's sitting at some great control desk determining what does and doesn't happen and all the rest of it, because it just doesn't seem to work out that way at all. And so I find an enormous part of my work and my life is devoted to helping, well, first of all, to destroy this kind of notion of God and to help people conceive of something bigger and wider. I'm probably never happier, really, than when I'm talking to a bunch of atheists, to be honest. And whenever I get the opportunity to do that, I do it, you know. Just a little while back, I went for the second time to talk to the Barnes Philosophy Club. Barnes is a lovely place in South London, and a woman who I got to know, she started out as an evangelical Christian. She became disaffected with all of that. She ended up sort of really leaving faith behind. She studied philosophy. She did end up saying that Plato and Jesus were her two heroes. And she decided that she would start this philosophy club in a pub in South London. And she asked me if I would go along and talk about what I understand a bad Christian to be. She said, they're all atheists, but they're quite friendly. And I had an amazing time. And I think probably one of the striking things was at the end of the talk, when we went into a time of questions, so many people, one after another, started off their question by saying, you've basically pulled the rug from under our feet. Because I had tried to deconstruct what their notion of God was, because I'm convinced that there's not a huge sort of gap between me and those people there. The God that they don't believe in is also a God I don't believe in. And so it's trying to get to, well, what is another way to think about God? Paul Tillich, the great Christian theologian and philosopher, said, if when we think about God, we're thinking about something that may or may not exist, we are not thinking about God. You know, so he was saying, God doesn't exist. God is existence. God is not a being out there. God is the ground of being. God is being itself. God is that out of which all life stems and emerges. So you could sort of think of it a bit like this, really. The sort of classic idea of theism is of a bit like the picture I gave, really, that God is up there, out there somewhere, and the world is down here. And occasionally we're led to believe that God sort of intervenes and sort of comes in and sort of does things down here, but basically God, his place is somewhere else. And so we, in prayer, are trying to appeal to this God up there, out there, to try to persuade God to do whatever it is that we think God ought to be doing. And so that's the kind of classic model, if you like. Pantheism is where God and the world are just basically one and the same thing. Everything is God, and God is everything. Atheism, of course, is that there's a world of material reality, but no God. And lots of us have become really disaffected with all of these options. And the one that often is spoken about these days is something called not pantheism, but panentheism. So the little term en, which is the Greek word in, it sits in the middle of it. And basically panentheism is saying that God is in everything and everything is in God. And this leads to a very different way of looking at the world and going out and connecting with the world and with people in the world. And I love, probably one of my favorite statements in the New Testament is Paul on the Mars Hill at the Areopagus, making this statement where he said to the people of Athens, "In God we live and move and have our being." Interestingly enough, he wasn't quoting any scripture there. He was quoting a Greek poet, Aratus. And he drew on this, what was current wisdom, I suppose, to say, this is how I understand God. God is that in which we live and move and have our being. Let me just give you another prayer here, because for me, praying is about theology. It's about stating theology. This is God beyond God, which is a statement or an idea of Paul Tillich, who I quoted a moment ago, who was always looking for the God, beyond our concepts of God, right? I can't believe you are bothered what name we give you when we feebly attempt to label the ineffable. I imagine you have greater things on your divine mind, if mind is something even worth contemplating, where you are concerned. Yahweh, Allah, Krishna, Waguru, God, or the far shore, as Buddhists say. What can these words possibly mean? You are the vivacious presence, saturating all things with joy. Landscapes, oceans and wild meadows, statuesque trees, croaking frogs, and a skylark's bubbling aria of delight, sunshine transfigured into sound. May we find contentment in knowing that you are indeed utterly ours and utterly everyone else's. The breath we share, the longing in our soul for goodness and love, the beauty and wisdom which all traditions aspire to express. You are the ultimate concern of all our best desires and yearning. You are God beyond God. Tillich said, "There is no place to which we could flee from God, which is outside of God." That's that idea of panentheism, everything in God and God in everything. There's no place to which we could flee from God, which is outside of God. And that's kind of at the heart of what I suppose I tried to convey to my parishioners who never came near a church. You may say, I don't go to church, but actually you can't escape God. God is part of your life, and you are part of the life of God, whether or not you call that God or whatever. I mean, one of the great ways to express that is in the idea of a fish in the ocean, okay? So, you see, this fish here, I don't really know whether that fish is an ocean denier or not. You know, could be for all I know. Could be swimming around saying, I don't believe in the sea, I don't believe in the ocean. Doesn't matter, because it's in the sea, and the sea is in it. And that's how I see the life of people in this world. I'm not trying to inject God into their lives, but to enable them to understand and see the God who is already there, who is already a part. I know some of you here, because you've already told me, have been involved with the Quakers, and I'm quite a Quaker at heart, really. I believe there is that of God in everyone, and that the light of Christ is present in every life, just as it says in the beginning of John's Gospel. Jesus Christ is the true light that enlightens everyone coming into the world. And so the great revolution of the early Quakers was that instead of pointing people to God over there and up there, they pointed them to God in here, to the God who is within. Another lovely way of expressing this for me is to think about this image here. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is the earth, right? And here you've got that little thin blue line. Sometimes it shows up as green, which is the atmosphere. Without the atmosphere, there'd be no life on Earth. I think you could say, in the atmosphere, we live and move and have our being. Because we're doing it right here and now, right? The air is in us and we're in the air. And I think that is a beautiful metaphor for God. God is that presence that is everywhere and which is inescapable, whether we name it as God or not, wherever we're coming from. And so it's from all that kind of background that I came up with this idea for how to be a bad Christian, which is basically saying that anyone who experiences love or appreciates beauty in art or nature, or who is fascinated by truth and meaning in life, or who simply senses gratitude for being alive on this beautiful planet, knows something of God, however God is named. And it's kind of about being human in the truest and deepest sense. So the only statement that we have in the Bible that is any kind of definition of God is love, right? And I know that when Gary stands here at the front of the church to marry a couple of people, and the church is full of people, probably many of whom don't go to church, the first words that he'll say in the Anglican service is the statement from John: God is love, and those who live in God live in love, live in God, and God lives in them. I think it's such a beautifully inclusive statement to say to a church full of people who probably mostly don't come to church. If you know anything about love, real love, not pink fluffy stuff, then you know God. Because that's what God is all about. Beauty and meaning and love and goodness and so on. So the kind of proposition that I had in writing How to Be a Bad Christian was something like this. What if we treat Christian as a verb instead of a noun? You know, if it's a way of being rather than a label or a badge that we wear, I think that changes everything. What if we think of the word Christian as a spiritual practice of following Jesus instead of a club that we belong to or a set of beliefs? A few years back now, at a midnight mass at St. Luke's, where I was a vicar, midnight mass is the same in most churches. The church can be packed full, often with faces that you don't recognize, all the regulars have gone to visit their families or whatever, and lots of people come in and you don't know who they are. And that was how it was on this particular night. The church was jam-packed full. And I gave the invitation that I always gave in introducing the Eucharist. This is the table of Jesus Christ, where all are welcome and no one is turned away. And therefore we offer bread and wine to every single person without exception. If you would like to receive, then you are welcome to. Because I believe that's kind of the gospel in action. Well, I didn't know actually that on that night there were 15 Muslim students in the congregation. I didn't know. I just looked out. I just looked at faces and people, different colours and backgrounds and everything else. I did notice that quite a few people out of the corner of my eye were opting for the non-alcoholic option rather than wine. But it was only afterwards I discovered that I'd actually given communion to 15 Muslim students. And talking to them afterwards, this one guy said, well, we've never ever been in a church ever before. But Jesus is honored in our tradition, and we wanted to come and celebrate his birthday with his followers. And I was overwhelmed. I never intended to give communion to 15 Muslim students, but you know what? I would have done it even if I had known. I was so pleased. And the next day, or a couple of days later, I was out on the street talking to two women, lesbian couple who live a few doors away down the road from the vicarage. And they were asking how things were going, and I said, well, I gave communion to 15 students, who are Muslims, and they didn't go to church at all, One of them said, "Steady, Dave, you're going to get us in there if you're not careful." And the other one said, "Do you know what?" She said, "I don't think you are a Christian." So, right, okay. She said, "I think you're a follower of Jesus." And I thought, oh my goodness, I will take that every time. Because actually, I don't think Jesus ever intended to start a new religion called Christianity. There's no evidence of that in the Gospels or anywhere. Jesus was a Jew from the day he was born to the day he died. What he did was he spoke mainly to Jewish people, but not exclusively, and pointed them to the very heart and core of their faith, just as the prophets did. He took them back. Religion, the word actually means to bend back, to fold back, to take you back to something. And I think that's what Jesus did. As a result, we do have a religion called Christianity, and I'm a Christian. I have no problem with that. But really, I'm much more comfortable with the way Christians were referred to right at the very beginning, for the first, 20 years or so, before the word Christian was invented, when they were spoken of as people of the way. Which way? The way of Jesus, the way that he taught and demonstrated and opened up. And therefore, I take this very much to heart that, yes, I'm comfortable to say I'm a Christian, but what does that really mean? It is to be a follower of Jesus. And so I think that, what he taught us about, what he brought to us, was what he called the kingdom of God, which is really the world and human lives as they would be if God's heart and desire for the world and for people was fulfilled. And so I think that we need what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. He said that we need to see ourselves as a great world house in which people of all different backgrounds and colours and persuasions and whatever religions, we realize that we're all one family, we're in one house. That to me is what Jesus means by the kingdom of God. Another phrase to encompass that is a companionship of empowerment. I love this phrase. The kingdom of God is a companionship of empowerment. It's a place of community that empowers people to be more fully and completely who and what they are and they were meant to be. More recently, I've been talking about a conspiracy of goodness. I think that's another way in which you could define the kingdom of God. I was writing a pause for thought for Radio 2 just after Christmas. And I don't know, I just suddenly found myself putting this phrase in, conspiracy of goodness. And I thought, that's quite good. And the guy who edits, you have to submit your scripts, and the guy who edits them at the BBC came back and he said, conspiracy of goodness. He said, wow, that's my motto for 2026. And I just suddenly realized that it rang a bell, because we're living at a time when there is so much that is depressing and challenging in our world. And if all you do is watch the news, you can have a nervous breakdown. You just get the impression that everything is just so dark and challenging and difficult. And I think that what we need is a conspiracy of goodness. People from whatever backgrounds, whatever religious traditions, wherever we're coming from, who are fellow travelers, kindred spirits in seeking goodness in the world. And you could say all of that is just humanity being human, because I think that is, at the end of the day, what Jesus came as. It's interesting that throughout his life, as we have it in the Gospels, Jesus barely ever, if at all, described himself as the Son of God. I mean, there are things you can imply it from, especially in John's Gospel. What he did describe himself as 80 plus times is the Son of Man, which actually simply means the human being. because I think Jesus came and showed us what being human is truly all about, what it is to be a human being in the sense that we're meant to be. And so I'll just finish with this little summary here, that the kingdom of God doesn't exist simply among religious people. Wherever the disadvantaged are empowered, wherever justice is practiced, wherever the excluded are welcomed, wherever friendship conquers prejudice and suspicion, wherever beauty is treasured and imagination liberated, or when truth is prized, regardless whoever speaks it, there, right there, is the kingdom of God. And so the fact of the matter is, folks, you know that there are hordes and hordes of people who will never come into a place like this, but who in their own way, they're part of the conspiracy of goodness. They seek to do the right thing, to make choices even to their cost, because they think that's the right thing to do. You know these people. They live in your road. They're in your circle of acquaintances of people who are not particularly religious. There are lots of them out there. This is what I'm describing as being bad Christians. People who may not adopt or subscribe to any particular creed or set of beliefs or doctrines or come to church on Sunday, but who respond in their hearts to what I think is the presence of God within each and every human being. And it's that to which I want to appeal and point people towards. Yes, I'd love them to come and fill the church out, of course. I've got a vested interest in that, but that's not ultimately what it's all about. It's about pointing people back to the God who speaks within the hearts and souls of each and every person. So that's where I'm going to leave it for the moment, and we're going to have a break, and I'd be very, very happy to hear your thoughts or to try to answer any questions that you have that are raised by things that I've said.
I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one.
Amen.
Any opportunity to sing a song.
Don't call us, we'll call you.
I had the light. No, I won't do that one.
He's starting again.
He's like it all the time. Any opportunity
I'm glad everyone's still here, so that's a good sign for a start. Thank you, Alison and crew, for serving drinks and refreshments. Fantastic, thank you very much as well. Before we unleash questions for Dave, I just want to draw attention to the next 2 weeks. So the intention is 3 talks during May, all different. Following week, the following Tuesday, Chris Hall, who's at the back. Chris, give us a wave. Woohoo! One of our own is talking about his grand tour of all the cathedrals in England and in Wales, which is impressive. Are you not impressed?
Sounds impressive.
Not only that though, but also their associated coffee shops. Yes! So we'll have a tour of all, I think it is, all of the cathedrals and coffee shops. Not all the coffee shops of England and Wales, but the ones that are specifically aligned to cathedrals. And then the following week is my now fairly infamous whistle-stop tour through 20th century art, with the aim of doing it in 1 hour exactly. So far, I've not managed to do it, but it doesn't go on for 4 hours either. But please do join us for that as well. You will come away amazed, enthralled, shocked, baffled. I'm thinking, how does the man breathe in that? But there we are. Right, so it's time for questions for Dave.
Yeah.
Dave, thank you so much for all of that. That
Thank
is
you.
absolutely brilliant so far, and I know it's stimulated lots of thoughts. Does anyone have a question they want to ask? Can we make the questions as short and brief as possible so we can kind of get to the pith of the questions?
Thank you, Dave. I have a question about spirituality, and you talked about theism, pantheism, etc., and atheism. Can atheists be spiritual?
Absolutely, yes. Yes. I think that, I'll be honest with you, some of the most spiritual people I know are atheists. Who are people, you see, it's a word, atheist. It's a badge, and it covers such a lot of variety. And I think there are all kinds of reasons why people are atheists, why they can't bring themselves or don't want to bring themselves to say that they believe in God. And as I already said, some of those reasons are ones that I would identify with. I don't believe in God in the way that, sometimes it's projected. But I think that there are people who are atheists who are some of the most profoundly loving, caring people that I know, people who are searching earnestly, perhaps more earnestly than many of us do, for the meaning of life and so on. But as I say, there are lots of reasons why people might stand in that kind of space of atheist. I think there are, on the one hand, what I would call fundamentalist atheists, the kind of so-called new atheists, I think, is a kind of a religious campaign in itself. And is a dogma, that's right. But I think there are lots and lots of other people who would identify as atheists who disavow that kind of approach altogether, who have much more of an openness, I think that I could just say that, just throw in the word humanist as well, which is a different word, and it's commonly assumed that if you're a humanist, you're an atheist. I don't think that is automatically true. And I think that the roots of humanism can quite clearly be shown to trace back into Christianity. And I would describe myself as both a Christian and a humanist, because I think that to be a follower of Jesus requires that we're a humanist. That's not an atheist, but someone who has certain values, which for me go back to Jesus. Other people may trace them somewhere else, but often they're the same.
Any?
One here.
I see a hand.
You see that hand?
I see that hand.
Like people I spoke to in the interval, I much resonate with everything you shared. A lot of it, though, is very positive about human nature, but there's a lot of negative things happening in the world, and some, like earthquakes and tsunamis, bad things. So I wondered where badness and evil fitted in with your beliefs.
Yeah, so I think that we live in an ambiguous world. If we just put the pin, first of all, in the kind of human side of it, I don't personally believe in the term original sin. I don't like that. I think that's a particular interpretation based on the story in Genesis, which I believe in original blessing, original goodness. But I think that we are creatures with a capacity to make moral choices. And in point of fact, for me, if you want to look at something you'd label original sin in the Bible, I wouldn't put it in the Garden of Eden. I'd put it in the following chapter, in the story of Cain and Abel, where God in the story says to Cain that sin, the first mention of sin in the Bible is there actually, where he says sin is crouching at the door. And it was almost like a sort of this creature that's waiting to pounce. And what the point was, it's what you do about that, that matters. So I think we are choice-making people, and a lot of people make very bad choices. We all probably make bad choices at some point in our lives, but I think some people make really, really bad choices. I mean, that give birth to what you could only call evil in the world. So I completely see that. I think that this is where I liked the kind of Quaker idea, of Christ being within everyone. I think that the mission for me is pointing people back to God, back to goodness within. Now, not everyone's going to make that choice, but I think that's the ambiguity of the world we live in. So I'm not unrealistic about the fact there's a lot of horrible things. There are a lot of things that make me really, really angry, sad, and depressed about the world. But then I think the presence of God's Spirit within gives birth to not just optimism, but a defiant hope that things can be turned around, that we can live in a different sort of world. And that's what I'm committed to. I think that the whole world of nature is a world that you can... I don't see it as being broken in the sense that of fallen, which is a word that, again, has nothing to do with... It's not in Genesis at all. I see it much more as about evolving and growing up into something. And so I think that the choices we make are choices of whether to evolve and grow and develop and become more godlike, or to go into reverse and become fixed in our own kind of ego selves. There are some hands around here, Gary. If you put them up. Hope that there'll be some women's hands.
Yes, I recognise that there is the capacity for spirituality in everybody, but not everybody is reflective or recognises that at all. How do you see your church actually helping to, and not just you individually, obviously you do, but how do you see the church as expressing that awareness of spirituality?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be more broader and more positive about it, I think there are lots of things in the world that call people to that reflectiveness. And sometimes I think I honestly witness more of it outside the church than I do inside. But I think that it is about sort of opening doors to people and offering people opportunities to think about things at different levels. There's another part of what Paul Tillich said is that he sort of said that there's both a surface and a vertical kind of dimension to life. And a lot of people spend most of their life just kind of skating around on the surface, just going through the motions of life and so on. But he said there's a depth dimension. And for Tillich, the depth dimension is God. That's where God is. And so he spoke about the fact that there are certain events in life that can kind of break the surface. And suddenly, so bereavement, for instance, can be one, can't it? Or moments of great ecstasy. I think one of my most depth dimension moments was holding my first daughter for the first time, and this little scrap of flesh and blood, and it was an ecstatic moment. Actually, I went out to the hospital and couldn't find my car. I've been in the hospital for so long, I couldn't remember where I parked it. And I looked all over Liverpool in the middle of the night looking for my car, till I eventually concluded rightly that it had been stolen. So I borrowed 10 shillings from the telephonist. Do you remember that? That's a double kind of blow there, isn't it? Telephonist and 10 shillings. But I borrowed 10 shillings to get a taxi home. And I can remember in the taxi feeling this absolute exaltation of feeling. My car's been stolen. My treasured powder blue Mini has been stolen, and I don't give a damn because I've got a daughter. So that's a moment of that. So there are those kind of things in life, I think, that break the surface. And I think there are other just moments of epiphany. And I think that I see my task, I see our task as the church to point people to those epiphanous moments in life and try to inspire people to to go on that journey of looking within instead of just, as I say, looking out and skating across all that's going on out there. And as I say, I think there are so many. I mean, it's interesting that I'm a trustee of the Greenbelt Festival, you know? And a few years back when I was first became a trustee, the festival invited a guy called Frank Turner to be one of the headline singers. Don't know if you know Frank Turner, great singer-songwriter. And somebody saw my name on the website and contacted me as a trustee and said, you know, this is my first time coming to the festival and I'm really disgusted to see you've got Frank Turner there. Don't you know that he's a patron of the British Humanist Society? He's an atheist and da-da-da, you see. And so I went back and I said, have you actually listened to any of his music? You know, the album that was out at that time is called Be More Kind. And that's a song which is a fantastic, inspirational song. I could sing it in church anytime. Well, Gary will sing anything, as you've seen. It's you know, and to me, I look at someone like Frank Turner. I've seen him in concert where he's almost like a priest, sort of staring hope and positiveness into people. And I think he's an evangelist. This is good news here he's bringing to people. You know, now, for whatever reason, he doesn't have the same beliefs as I do, but I don't think that changes the fact of who he is as a human being. And to me, that's about God's presence. It's God that makes people like Frank Turner.
Thanks for the talk, William. In your talk, you talked about spirituality and perhaps it being on a bit of a scale of more spiritual, you can be less, which I agree with. I apply that same logic to follower of Christ, and you could be more of a follower or less. And if you would agree with that, my question is, what's the measure about what's more and what's less? Not what's good and bad, but what do you measure that against?
Yeah, well, I think the thing, and I often say I'm a Jesus freak, you know. Jesus to me is, without Jesus, the whole lot is dross. I'd give it all up, you know. And times when I've been tempted to give up this religious Christian thing, it's Jesus that reconverts me back. And when I look at Jesus in the Gospels, I think he's someone who called people to be followers, I mean, that's what he said all the time, follow me. That it's about a way of life, a way of being. So too often, I think, within Christianity, we've made the measure to be about believing certain things. You know, tick these boxes, believe these 4, 5, 6 things or whatever, and then you're a Christian. And there was none of that in Jesus. Jesus never asked people to subscribe on a single occasion to a particular proposition, you know, about God or heaven or whatever. What he did do, he called people to behave in certain ways, to be a certain kind of person. I mean, the classic example, I think, is the so-called rich young man who came and said, what must I do to have eternal life? Well, in the upbringing I had, I know what the answer to that question is, but Jesus apparently didn't know it, you know, because he said, keep the commandments. That's exactly the wrong answer in the background I've had, and to sell all his goods and give to the poor. And he went away sorrowful because that was too big a demand for him. You know, Zacchaeus, when Jesus called him down for the tree and he went to his house for tea, as the chorus I grew up singing, you know, Zacchaeus said, you know, I'm going to change it all. I'm going to give this money back. I'm going to give 4 times. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. And Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house. So I think salvation wasn't about believe these things. It was about make these decisions, live this kind of life, choose this way. So I think the way to answer your question, the way I'd measure the greater or lesser is to do with how much we respond to the actual demands and requirements of Christ upon us in order to be followers. So, for instance, I've had people who've sort of been wanting to test my authenticity or my orthodoxy, right? Who've said, well, do you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, or the blood? They smell these things out that they think I might be a bit woolly on, and I sometimes say, why are you asking me that? Why don't you ask me how I treat my wife, and my children? Why don't you ask me what I do with my money? Why don't you ask me about, the way my attitude towards poverty in the world, or whatever? Because if you take, the parable that Jesus told at the end of Matthew, it was all about, you fed this person, you visited this person in prison, and inasmuch as you did those things, you did it to me. And the separation at the end was not a separation between what church you belonged to, what religion, what beliefs you had, but how you'd actually behaved toward these situations in the world. Is that okay? Does that answer it? Yeah. Where is Gary anyway?
Gary's fighting with a microphone.
Is he? Do you want to borrow mine?
Who has the next? This man has a voice that is audible.
Yeah, that's fine. Howard here, in asking the question, introduced the tsunami, the volcano, the earthquake, that are not related to man's activity or choices. The hard question: how do you reconcile a God of love with the tsunami, the earthquake, the volcano?
Okay, so that's a really hard question, obviously, and it kind of goes back to a classic question that's been around for a long time, of how you reconcile, a God who is all loving, who's all good, and all powerful. Because if God is all love and all powerful, then why doesn't God sort these things out, you see? So, you can call me a heretic or whatever, but I don't believe God is all powerful. I believe God is powerful, but not all powerful. And in fact, I think for there to be any other power around, which we have power, then that detracts from the idea that God has all power. But I think that omnipotence is an idea that I think comes more from kind of Greek philosophy than it does from the Bible. And so I think this is a huge question, and obviously I've just stepped into it now and could get very stuck and need a lot more time to answer it. But I'm very much convinced of a line of thinking in theology called process theology, which does not believe in divine omnipotence, but does believe that it's all about love, So I think that God's love is the greatest power that there is. But I think it's an uncontrolling love. It's not a love that controls. It's a love that grants freedom. And, and therefore you can't have it both ways, So I think that God's, and you have it specifically stated in Jesus, don't you, that he divested himself of power. And I think love, any real understanding of love, is that it's uncontrolling. Love doesn't control, or it's not love. So I think if we affirm that God is love primarily, that is our main affirmation of God, then we have to sort of give up something of the idea of God being all-powerful and controlling, because apart from the else, evidently that doesn't work. It's just not how it is. Or else there'd be, a million situations in the world that we'd expect God to intervene in and do something about. So if I put it another way, to quote the line of a song by Nick Cave, I don't believe in an interventionist God, but I don't therefore believe in an impotent God or an absent God. Rather, I believe in an interactional God. So take what I've said about panentheism. The interventionist God assumes that God is out there somewhere, and controls things from somewhere out there and intervenes in them occasionally. Whereas my understanding of God is much more of a God who is utterly immersed in the material reality, is a part of the world, and is therefore influencing, enticing, drawing, luring things into the better pathway that is possible, rather than being someone who is controlling everything. So that changes the whole nature of prayer for me. So I'm not therefore praying to a great monarch out there to grant some decree and make something happen. Rather, in prayer, I'm aligning myself with the power and force of love and wholeness in the world. And I think in a way that I can't properly or fully understand, that my love energy becomes united with God's love energy. And therefore I think prayer matters, but not in the sense of a sort of, order something from Amazon and they'll send it tomorrow, but more in the sense of alignment and co-creating and joining with the power of God in the world. Is that?
Thank you.
That's great. We have 2 minutes. So I think one last question. Gareth is. We've changed microphones.
Okay, again, this might be too big a question, but you talked about the church having more sort of evangelical zeal with this message, and I really enjoyed your message. It's really aligns with what I like to think, and I'd love to learn more. But I wanted to know just a little bit more, because we've only got 2 minutes, but what sort of things would you like to see the church, and presumably us, do in terms of that evangelical zeal with this message, which is quite different to the traditional message, as you alluded to?
I think that it's about being more immersed in and involved with the community and things that are happening, because a lot of people are doing a lot of good things in the world round about us, in the community. And I think that sometimes the church seems to have felt this impulse to have a Christian alternative version of that. Do you know what I mean? And so, for instance, for a long time we used to talk about Christian art. What's Christian art? There's art. There's good art, there's bad art. Christian art, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you have Christian messages in it or something? Well, that's not art, that's propaganda. That sort of thing. So if you take that same principle and put it in lots of different areas, sometimes we've ended up with a lot of, I think, rather second-rate Christian alternatives, instead of being a part of the great flow, which I think is the flow of God's Spirit. Because I think if we can just appreciate the fact that, God's Spirit doesn't live in here. Hopefully the Spirit is in here, but God's Spirit is everywhere, out there working in all kinds of ways. And so things that people might call, projects or, enterprise or whatever, may well be the impulse of the Holy Spirit, I think. And so I think we need to be much more involved with things that are going on in the community, and be much more generous in inviting them to be a part of things that we're doing in here too. We've somehow got to sort of more and more try and just make these walls a lot more porous, and much more dotted lines rather than big firm lines, of in and out, and just recognize God's working out there and God's working in here. But we need to sort of just get more into flow going in that kind of way. But I think this is, to me, my wife Pat, who is here too, where are you? She's there. And she asked me to say that she's got copies of my books back there, and she's got a thing where you can a reader, so you can just pay back on. No, I said it, love. And but Pat said to me, she was the first person to read. She's the first person to read everything I say, but she was the first person to read the text for How to Be a Bad Christian. And I said, what do you think? And, she's a sort of straightforward person, Pat, One time, I'm just distracted there. One time, when I was going through a big sort of upheaval of, deconstructing all my beliefs and what do I think about this and that, and it was all very, hard, and Pat said, when you've decided what we believe, let me know. And that was a profound statement, you see, because for her, faith's about something different to me. I've grown up with the fact that faith is all about all these propositions and beliefs and ideas and doctrines and things that I still wrestle with. Whereas for Pat, it's much more down here in the gut. It's much more to do with how you treat people, how you live, how you go about your daily life, which actually I think is a lot more Jesus-like, you know. But anyway, she read the book, and I said, what do you think about it? And she says, it's the good news, Dave. And I thought, well, that's all I need to hear, really, because I believe there is a gospel. I believe there's good news, but I think it's much bigger and broader and wider and deeper than the message is sometimes reduced down to be into this, you know, religious kind of core of things. So, yeah, I think, I mean, look, guys, it's a hell of a mess out there at the moment. And I think lots of trends and patterns of progress that I thought were now well established in our world are suddenly being assaulted and questioned and going into reverse. I feel in so many ways we're going backwards instead of forwards. And I think that it is vital that we as Christian people, along with lots of others out there, do not just sit back and let that happen. That we stand for the things that are important to us, because I think these are gospel things. These are important things to the message of Jesus. So I feel hopeful, you know, but my definition of hope is this. I think that hope is not optimism. It's not kind of, you know, positive thinking and stuff. I think that hope to me is defiant reimagination, even in the face of despair. So it's got to have that defiant element to it, that metal. It's also about imagination, because hope is basically a function of the imagination, right? It's what can we, it's what if? What if? It's being able to reimagine things. And it doesn't matter whether we get a quick or a speedy sort of outcome to that. We're committed to it because we're committed to it. But I think there's that defiance that says, you know, there's one of my favorite preachers at the moment is a woman rabbi in Los Angeles called Sharon Brous, B-R-O-U-S. Check her out, she's great. And she is the rabbi of a big sort of progressive synagogue in LA. And I love her sermons. I love her unpacking of the Old Testament, as we call it, you know, the Hebrew Scriptures. But she was saying, I was listening to her just recently, she was talking about the son of one of her best friends. And this best friend that she had was an Israeli woman who lived very close to the border with Gaza. And she was murdered on October the 7th, you know, by Hamas. And but her whole life, like so many who were killed that day, was committed to peacemaking and justice for Palestinians and reconciliation and so on. And so she was murdered, and her son has picked up the baton and is running on with it and going on with it. And she said, I was talking to Jonathan just last week, and she said, just about everybody I know at the moment is flat on the floor in despair. How do you find hope? And he said, I don't focus on hope. I don't get up in the morning and feel hopeful. I get up in the morning and do the work. And I thought, wow, that is very powerful. That hope is doing the work. It's not about trying to get yourself feeling psyched up or whatever. It's doing what you've got to do because you believe in it with all your heart and you're defiant about that. And I think that's what our world needs right now. And I think that's good news, don't you? Thank you very much for giving me your time and your ears this evening.
Thanks once again, Dave. Pat, thanks for keeping him on the path as well. Yeah, and Dave is going to be around for another 10, 15 minutes or so to sign books and things like that, so please do stick around. And then please, if you can, come back in the next 2 weeks. 2 totally different things, but you know, cathedrals, coffee shops and modern art. Why not? Why not?